Hello everyone, this is Gen Z Talks bringing you another video. The video for today is the Southern strategy, how the Republicans went from being a Northern party to now winning the Deep South. As you may or may not know, the Democrats used to be the party of the Deep South, the party of the KKK and slavery, and that evidently changed within a few decades. Just take a look over here. Take a look at the blue, which stands for Democrats on this map. And just keep paying attention to the South, the southern part of the country. Democrats always used to win the Deep South. But it wasn't until 1960 that the Southern strategy was put in place. But different versions of it were put in place here and there, with people like Strom Thurmond, who's a Dixiecrat, who ran third parties, being anti-segregation and all that. But it wasn't really official until the 60s. So pay attention to the Deep South. Democrats always won the Deep South if it weren't for third parties. Deep South, Dwight Eisenhower won for Democrats. When he won in a landslide, it was the Democrats. 1960, JFK versus Richard Nixon. The Democrats won most of the South, except there was a third party run by Byrd and Thurmond, which was a really small one. As you could see, they didn't really get much votes. But either way, it was a small run, and they ended up winning their home states, respectively, and they won the Deep South. But other than that, the Democrats always won the South. As you paid attention from the 1944 elections to 1960, most of the time they just won the Deep South, even when the Republicans won in the landslide. Now, other than Strom Thurmond and a few here and there, as I said, the Democrats always won the Deep South. But it didn't make nothing was big until 1964, where Lyndon B. Johnson won the presidency in a landslide. And guess who won the Deep South? As a Republican. For the first time, the Republican won the Deep South. Barry Goldwater, the guy who ran on states' rights and anti-big government. Whether he was racist or not, that's up for debate. But this guy ran on anti-big government, he was big on states' rights, and he ran as being the guy who opposed the Civil Rights Bill because he saw it as government intrusion. He evidently won his home state of Arizona, and he won the Deep South. Keep in mind, as stated before and through the past few election photos, this was the first time the Republicans won the Deep South. So that's that. Then 1968 comes over. Richard Nixon runs on states' rights and law and order, which, if you're not aware at this time, has to do with the 1968 race riots. I'll bring up a video to show soon. But it was Richard Nixon versus Hubert Humphrey, Democrat of Minnesota, and George Wallace, who was a former Democrat, well, you can call him a Dixiecrat, but he ran as an American independent from the home state of Alabama. And if it weren't for George Wallace, Richard Nixon would have won the South in a landslide. But yeah, George Wallace was Richard Nixon, but a lot more racist. He ran on, as he can say it himself,
that have ever trod this earth. I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Yeah, that's an actual quote. And yes, that's not taken out of context. George Wallace ran in the Deep South as a former Democrat running on states' rights, and he ran on segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Like, this guy was openly racist and evidently won the Deep South. But this was the time of the 1968 race riots, as I mentioned earlier. So Richard Nixon ran as a law and order and states' rights candidate. Law and order is because there's a lot of race riots on the streets and protests as similar to today. So he said, I'm going to put in laws and there's going to be order. And this is, just take a look, you'll understand. It was a bit of race baiting because this was based off of the assassination of MLK and a lot of civil rights leaders.
Dissent is a necessary ingredient of change. But in a system of government that provides for peaceful change, there is no cause that justifies resort to violence. Let us recognize that the first civil right of every American is to be free from domestic violence. So I pledge to you, we shall have order in the United States.
Yeah, so he ran on law and order, as I stated before. It was all based on bringing peace back in the streets after the 1968 riots. Not to mention, this guy ran on the war on drugs, which were also proven to be race-baited, and also, yeah, it was pretty much race-baited. Just listen to his aide, who even admitted it.
He did in full. You want to know what this was really all about? Ehrlichman said to the reporter. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
Dirty tricks was what Richard Nixon was all about, including Watergate.
So, let's get this clear. Richard Nixon ran on states' rights, law and order, and he ran on tough-on crime like war on drugs, which made it so that you can get a mandatory minimum sentence for possessing marijuana or crack cocaine. Now, this wasn't the only time, as Richard Nixon, he also won landslide 1972 election, but that's also due to the fact that George McGovern and the Democratic Party weren't really doing that well. But his law and order campaign, in addition to his war on drugs, worked really well, and he won landslide, especially the Deep South, despite there being a third-party run. Now comes the 1976 election. People say, oh, this Southern strategy doesn't work. See, Jimmy Carter won. No. You tend to win the region you're from. Jimmy Carter was a Democrat, Southern Democrat from Georgia. He evidently won his home state, and you tend to win the region you're from. He was very popular in the South. So he ran on that, and Jimmy Carter ended up tiptoeing and winning the election, winning the Deep South. Keep in mind. Yeah, Jimmy Carter wasn't really that successful as a president, but here comes Ronald Reagan, the guy who runs on states' rights, welfare queens, which was a signaling to people in the South for black single mothers trying to quote-unquote leech off the system. And he made very much racial attacks, including government attacks, also big on states' rights, and big anti-government guy like Barry Goldwater. But he really, really was based off of race. I mean, look at this. And also, keep in mind there's a third party, but either way, Reagan won with big margins, and the only state in the South that was blue, other than West Virginia, but I'm talking Deep South, was Jimmy Carter's home state of Georgia. And now I'll bring you to the Ronald Reagan stuff, if you don't understand what I'm talking about.
In 1980, Reagan returned for a new presidential campaign. He was still calling for welfare reform, but now he was doing so as part of a much broader message. He talked of states' rights and of returning America to a better bygone era. While his message had a powerful appeal to many African Americans, it seemed like a thinly veiled attack on the progress made since the Civil Rights Movement.
He runs on this campaign that's like, listen, we're going to actually make America great again. And then implicitly in that is the idea that making America great means we basically have to kind of put black people in their place.
We are taking our country back. We're making it great again. Reagan was setting that tone, and black folk were saying, anytime Whitey Leaf's talking about taking that country back, you know what they mean. They coming at us with intensity.
Reagan made good on his campaign promises by rolling back social programs and making significant...
So yeah, he ran on Let's Make America Great Again, states' rights, welfare cuts, welfare queens. And in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where civil rights leaders were killed, he went to there and had a rally and ran on, you guessed it, states' rights. Now, a year after this, Lee Atwater, his campaign strategist, ended up even admitting that this whole thing, Southern strategy, was real and based off of race. Here's real quotes.
Here's how I would approach that issue as a statistician or a political scientist, or no, as a psychologist, which I'm not, is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all aren't quoting me on this. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, backfire. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now. You're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, nigger, you know. So any way you look at it, race is coming on the back burner.
So yeah, that was Lee Atwater on the infamous Southern strategy. Now if you want to learn more about Reagan and his race baiting, here's a video.
He invented voodoo economics. On race, his ideas couldn't have been more Tea Party if he shouted them from a rascal scooter. He ran on states' rights. He invented the notion that black people get all the breaks, constantly telling the story of the Chicago woman.
Now, if you don't know this, Chicago woman tends to correlate to inner city black woman.
Wink, wink. Who has 80 names, 30 addresses, 12 social security cards, and her tax-free cash income is over $150,000. And that woman today is RuPaul. Actually, that woman never existed. Reagan just made shit up, something else he pioneered for his party of today. He described the New Deal as fascism, Medicaid recipients as waiting for handouts, unemployment insurance as prepaid vacation for freeloaders, and once said, "A tree's a tree. How many more do you need to look at?" He was the original official pitchman for batshit. When they hold up signs that say no socialized medicine,
So yeah, this guy was Barry Goldwater out to the max. Like, everyone knows this. This is all proof here. So now let's cut over to the 84 election. 84, more people kept buying on Reagan's promises, and he evidently won in a landslide, won the Deep South. Okay, that's DC over there. And then comes the famous, or in this case, infamous, 1988 election, where it's his vice president who's running, George H.W. Bush, versus Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts. See, this race was pretty close, but before this infamous Willie Horton ad was put in, Michael Dukakis was actually leading in the polls. He was leading in the polls until this ad, which I didn't even know was race baiting, but at the time, at the context it was used, it was race baiting. You want to take a look at it? Here it is.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
Yes. Now, you may not realize that's about race, but at the context at the time, after all the race baiting done, this was actual race baiting. See, Willie Horton, Willie is not his real name, that's his nickname. And it showed a mugshot of an African-American male, which at the time playing into the fears of the scary big black man, and ran that ad. This was when Michael Dukakis was leading in the polls. George H.W. Bush and his associates ran this campaign ad and he ended up winning the popular vote. And guess what? He wins the South. Now the next one, 1992. This was one of the few times the South becomes more democratic, as it's a Southern governor, Bill Clinton, and Al Gore from Tennessee, who are running against two other people. Evidently, George H.W. Bush goes to Texas. Ross Perot is also from Texas, but George H.W. is a bigger name, therefore he gets more votes. So everyone was pulling votes away from each other, making this really weird map. Some of the southern states went to Bill Clinton, evidently his home state of Arkansas, and Al Gore's home state of Tennessee. Even some random states like Montana went blue, but that's because there was two other candidates running. They're pulling votes against votes from each other. So that's one of them. But just keep it in mind, a lot of the South still voted for the Republican Party. See, right here, 1996, more of them vote for the Republicans, from Virginia all the way back down to Mississippi. Evidently, it's just a few states here and there. And Ross Perot running as a third party. Bob Dole wins his home state of Kansas. I've already told you which states Bill Clinton's from. Bill Clinton did use some version of race, but not really. When describing crime in the majority black neighborhoods, he used the term inner city crime. Same with Hillary Clinton, his wife, who did the same thing. And also, because the Democrats had lost 3 elections in a row, 80, 84, and 88, they had to bounce back. So Bill Clinton wrote the infamous 1994 crime bill because they had to show that they're tough on crime. So that kind of helped him win the election. Then comes the 2000 election, which is solidified. Deep South votes Republican. Al Gore couldn't even win his home state of Tennessee. 2004, Deep South, Republican. 2008, Deep South, Republican. Florida's Democrat. And then evidently John McCain wins Arizona. 2012, Barack Obama, Deep South to the Republicans. And 2016, Deep South to the Republicans. This shows that the Southern strategy from the 1960s was playing up to today. And that made the Democrats win the North and the Southern states go to the Midwest. Southern states go to the Republicans. And that's the party switch, folks.